stepdad cheats on my mom, so we get revenge. This may be a long one. Apologies in advance. I moved in with my mom after her marriage of 25 years with my dad was ended. He was a manipulative asshole, but that's another story. Shortly after the divorce, my mom introduced me to her boyfriend at the time, Chris. Now, my mom worked as a corrections officer at the county jail. The boyfriend was a former inmate in for a DUI. That should have been the first red flag, but my mom was grieving a long marriage, and I didn't want to push the subject. Chris seemed to make her happy, and that was enough for me. Me, bro, and sis all moved in with mom and Chris, and we seemed to get along okay. Chris and I bonded a bit over our love of video games, and all seemed well. That is, until 2017. Due to Chris's prior DUI, he had to go in regularly for probationary checkups at the courthouse. One day he didn't return and we got a little worried. We then received a phone call from him from Texas. Turns out when he arrived at the courthouse that day, he was jumped by the FBI. His family from Texas was implicated in a number of gang and drug-related crimes, and due to a situation where he was in a vehicle during a drug handoff, he was on the hook as well. He ended up agreeing to testify against his family members in exchange for a shorter sentence and being allowed to be out of prison before the trial. My mom was distraught, and over the course of many phone calls over a year, they worked out their marriage plans when he returned. His store owner at the DQ he worked at allowed him to come back as well, back to his store manager position. Soon after, the drinking started. Now, obviously, because of his DUI, Chris was clearly no stranger to drinking. He began to drink more and more, to the point where he was consuming half a 24-pack of beer a day. He regularly started fights when wasted, and while they never got physical, he wasn't exactly kind with his words. My mom enabled his behavior for several years, saying the stress was getting to him from work and from the upcoming trial. Finally, after several years, my mom had enough. Chris came home extremely drunk one night, and my mom confronted him. She asked if he'd been drinking, and when he didn't deny it, she kicked him out. He went to live with a friend temporarily. The next morning, Mom asked us to help gather a few of his essentials so that he didn't have to re-enter the home until he was sober. While we were gathering his things, we heard a knock at the front door. We opened it to find Betty, one of Chris's co-workers and someone I went to high school with. She told my mom she had something important to share. After sitting my mom down and telling her not to share where she got the info from, Betty told my mom about how Chris was cheating on my mom with Darla, how he regularly had Darla perform sex acts in and around his workplace, how Betty had caught them, and how Chris told her that if she ever told my mom, he'd fire her. He was the store manager. And finally, how Darla was pregnant. My mom was angry. After the initial shock wore off, she told us to round up all of Chris's things and to dump them outside. We took everything of his out of the house and tossed it all in the alley behind our house. Chris had no reason or ability to return to the house. It was rented with only my mom on the paperwork, so no issues there. In the meantime, she called and confronted him. He confessed to the entire affair and that he was happy Darla was pregnant because that meant he'd finally have a child of his own. Mom refused to have more kids. We three were massive strains on her body. She likely wouldn't survive anymore. He refused to apologize for any of his actions. My mom arranged for him to collect his items from the alley, with an officer present, and he left our lives. The revenge. Now, my mom clearly wanted to dust her hands of him and move on. She was already quite emotional from the whole ordeal and wanted nothing more from him. But sis, bro, and I had other ideas. First, we called his workplace. DQ operates as an independently owned franchise, and the owner of this branch owned several branches in the area. He was also a good friend. We informed him of the acts being performed on the premises, and he went through the process of getting Chris booted from his position and barred him from any of the branches in the area. Funnily, Betty got his position after he left and now runs a tight and clean ship. Chris no longer had a job or a place to live, and so went to live with Darla in a town about an hour away. We found out that he started working at another DQ in that town and informed the owner of that location of the situation. It took significantly longer due to there being no current indecent actions occurring there, but eventually he lost that job too. Soon after, Chris began driving around our neighborhood, seemingly stalking my mom and our family, probably because of his job loss. Now, due to the whole situation in Texas, he never had his probation lifted for his DUI and thus still did not have a license. He never had to drive when he lived with us since work was local and we could drive him as needed. But here he was, clearly driving around by himself when he shouldn't be. We contacted the police and informed them about Darla's vehicle in our neighborhood and that we believed Chris was driving it without a license. We told them to pull over the vehicle next time they see it, as it would likely be driving again. Sure enough, a few weeks later, we were told that Chris indeed was pulled over and sent back to the local jail for driving without a license and while intoxicated. The police also did a search of the home he was staying at and found several guns at the premises. Since he was a felon, he was not legally allowed to have weaponry on the premises, meaning there was more jail time tacked on. By the time his jail time had finished, it was just in time for him to be sent back to incarceration in Texas for the trial. Chris's son was born while Chris was in prison. Darla evidently realized what an absolute Chris was and cut ties with him while he was in prison. During his prison time, Chris started sending tones of letters to my mom, stating how sorry he was, pleading to take him back and ranting about how it wasn't his fault. All in the same letter, mind you. Mom burned every one of them. We moved on, moving out of state. Chris evidently got out of prison some years ago and now lives in Kansas, struggling and fighting child support, which Darla sued him for. Mom now has a new boyfriend who treats her right and cares a lot more than Chris ever did. Bro and sis moved on and out, and I still live with Mom, assisting her with the newly purchased home that we've been renovating. Life is looking okay. I was reminded of this by a chat with a coworker about cheaters, and thought to post it here for others to enjoy. Here are top comments on the post. The first one is from Shager. Why did a DUI and driving on a suspended license, two crimes that give absolutely no reasonable suspicion of a crime being committed in the home he had been staying in, give the local police the right to search a house about an hour away in another town, which would also lie outside their jurisdiction? Lone Ranger replies to Shager. Due to his probation, he was supposed to be getting regular checkups on his home, which involved the probation officer walking around the house, observing and checking to make sure he wasn't breaking the rules of his probation. We actually had to sit through several of these checkups while he still lived with us, and my knife collection actually almost got him in trouble for it. When he moved, the probation officer didn't have a chance to search his new home, or didn't find anything originally. I'm not entirely certain on specifics, but I do know that after he was taken in from the driving and DUI, they had to do a fresh checkup wherein they found the guns. It was less of a police search and more of a probationary checkup. I didn't have enough characters to clarify that. Apologies. Shager responds to Lone Ranger, so the word probationary isn't contained anywhere in the federal statute you cited, and state law governs what probation officers can't do, and, as the other dude said, they can't perform a search without a warrant or probable cause that would be sufficient to obtain a warrant plus exigent circumstances. A DUI by itself doesn't provide either the probable cause sufficient to search. Maybe they found pictures of naked little boys on his phone or a man's nose inside of a brick of meth in the glove box. Then he might get his home searched. The next comment is from cultural_ad_6174. Revenge is revenge when in balance on what your reason for vengeance is. You should have stopped at the yard sale thing, but to with this guy 2 decades later over some kid that actually help you become stronger later in life. And you tried to ruin his life when you don't even know if he changed his ways and redeemed himself. Do you realize he possibly thinks about his old behavior and feels like a piece of shit over it? Some people's guilt charges them because they carry it for life. You took it too far, dude. Now karma is coming for you. It was an epic revenge. Chris, the cheater and criminal, lost everything. His job, his home, and eventually his freedom, all due to his own actions. OP and his siblings executed the revenge in a very calculated manner. And the good thing is that they didn't adopt any illegal or below-the-belt means. They just exposed Chris's reality, the reality about his crimes. Throughout it all, your mom found peace, moved on, and began a new life, while Chris was left with nothing but regret. Justice was poetic and well-deserved. Story number 2 is from Caledon, the 90s, revenge on a client who tried to throw me under the bus. I was pushing 40 and I'd learned a lot of lessons in more than 10 years of legal practice. But one of the most important lessons I learned was from an older lawyer that I worked for as a summer student after the second year of law school. A lawyer has 3 duties, he told me. First, to himself, second to the court, and last, the client. Always make sure you come first, and the client comes last. The reason? Because clients will you, he said. They'll throw you under the bus without thinking twice. I should have stayed with this lawyer. But being young and an idiot, I had to go work downtown, and I'm still downtown now. But fortunately for me, I remembered this lesson, and it came in handy many years later when a client really did try to throw me under the bus. My client was this mid-sized company that did this and that and owned things here and there, not big enough to be listed, but it did have a pretty sizable real estate portfolio, and one day a building they owned burned to the ground. The company wanted to collect on the insurance, so they told Frank, a veteran salaryman, to deal with it. Frank was close to 60 and thought he knew what he was doing. He didn't need me to help him with the insurance claim, he told me. He had everything under control. Besides, lawyers are expensive. Some guys really get off on not paying legal fees, and Frank was one of those guys who gloated over every penny that he managed not to pay to the lawyers. I dealt with Frank a lot, and he was always nickel and dimming me. The insurer is going to f*** you, I told Frank. It was only by luck that I even knew about the fire and the loss because Frank had not asked for my help. He'd just let it slip one day, and since then, I'd kept on top of him. Trying to get him to smarten up, I'd had to fight to get him to send me the proof of loss form to make sure he hadn't messed that up. Frank f***ed up a lot, and I wondered sometimes how he had a job. But the proof of loss was okay. At least. So that was one less thing to worry about. You don't know that, he said. I could tell he just wanted to get me off the phone. I'm paid to know when insurers are trying to screw my clients, I said. And the insurer is going to screw you. They've been stringing you along for ages with requests and questions and paperwork. But they aren't going to pay you, not unless you sue them. But Frank said he knew what he was doing, that it was all under control, and besides, he got along with the adjuster so great. The limitation period expires in 2 weeks, I said, and once those 2 weeks pass, it will be too late to sue. The moment that limitation period expires, they will stop taking your calls. You'll get a final email saying, sorry, you're out of time, and that will be that. Don't leave this till the last minute. Let me sue right now and you'll have the money in no time. Frank was like, sure, fine, whatever. Don't bother me. I got this blah, blah, blah. And he got off the phone as soon as he could. I sent him the usual email with clear warnings and recommendations, which he ignored. I sent the email again, and then again as the limitation period approached, and again a couple of days before the deadline. I'm going to be at trial and you won't be able to reach me, my final email said, but you have to sue. You have other firms on your list, so pick one and sue. He didn't bother to reply, and I went off to do my trial. The trial lasted a couple of weeks, and there was no email from Frank. Then a month passed, and another month. Still no email. I figured he must have sorted things out. Maybe Frank was right after all, I said to myself. And then my phone rang. It was Frank. Remember that fire insurance thing we spoke about? We'd only spoken about it like a dozen times. I figured he was calling up to gloat, so I cut to the chase. So they paid out. That's great, Frank. You were right. He asked me what I was talking about. A copy of the claim. What claim? I said. The claim against the insurer. You know, that claim. Does that mean the insurer didn't pay? I said. He hung up on me, and then a few minutes later, my computer dinged, and there was Frank's email, talking about how we spoke, and he told me to sue, and he was worried when I hadn't sent him a copy of the claim, so he was following up to get a copy of the claim. I emailed him back. I take it that the insurer didn't pay you, just like I told you they wouldn't, and now that the limitation period is expired, They told you to jump in the lake, leaving you with a loss in the millions. Is that it? I'd made a mistake by not going over Frank's head when he wouldn't listen to me. But if I'd gone over Frank's head, I never would have received another file from him, so I didn't. But that was then, and this was now. So I CC'd Frank's boss and his boss's boss, plus I CC'd Bill, the client's in-house counsel. Bill acknowledged my email right away and called me later that day. Frank messed up, he said. We know that. He's an idiot, so what do we do? So his excuses didn't work. Nope. Bill explained that they'd summoned Frank to a boardroom, but his story didn't add up, given all the warnings I'd sent him. Besides, there would have been no reason for him to keep emailing the insurer if he'd told me to sue. Once the file goes to legal counsel, Frank's role is over. The company knew Frank was bullshitting them. So that's it then? Bill said. We just lost a couple of $1,000,000. It's okay, I said, explaining that when I realized that Frank was going to f up, I issued a claim against the insurer. Because I'd made Frank send me the proof of loss a while earlier, I had enough information that I could sue to preserve the cause of action. Not a great claim and short on details, but good enough. You sued without instructions? Bill said. Lawyers aren't supposed to sue without instructions, because if you do that, you're personally liable for whatever costs the other side incurs. It's a big deal to sue without instructions. Yup, I said, I sued without instructions. I pulled up a copy of the claim and emailed it to him as we spoke. It's a little rough, I said, but we can always amend. Thank God, Bill said. Can I leave it with you? Of course he could. The insurer was a sitting duck, and I knew I'd collect from them, no problem. A few days later, I got a call from another guy who worked for the client, a guy I didn't normally deal with. They had a situation and needed my help. I usually deal with Frank, I said. What's up? What was up was that Frank got called into another meeting and they handed him a one-page letter, and then he put his little office things in a box, and security walked him past his co-workers to the elevator and escorted him downstairs to the parking lot. Bye-bye, Frank. He was too old to get another job, or at least not a decent one. It was a life-changing event for Frank. But for me, he was just an anecdote, a cautionary tale that I tell young lawyers sometimes over beers, maybe too often, because I'm getting on in years and I have my favorite stories. I wasn't trying to get revenge on Frank. Not at all, and I would have felt a bit sorry for him if he hadn't been trying to throw me under the bus, but the guy who replaced him was great and never nickeled and dimmed me, so it was all good. Here are some top comments on the post. The first comment is from Lehman's Dynasty. As a tax firm owner, this is beautiful. I'm usually doing the same thing to other accountants instead of an in-house employee. We are drilling into our senior accountant's head. Always send in CYA summary email after client meetings, especially recommendations for insurance, estate, business, contract, lawyer consults. I'll even type out our concerns and questions we think you ask your lawyer. I know the answer, but I'm not allowed to give that advice. The next comment is from clever username 5D31. If you sued, why did they stop responding to him at the suit deadline? OP replies to clever username 531. I sued without my client's permission, just to make sure the limitation period didn't expire. The issued claim stayed in my file so that I could serve it if the client didn't get paid. The insurer didn't know I'd issued the claim. And so when I took over, they started by saying, "Too bad, so sad you missed the limitation period." I said, "Any other grounds?" And the adjuster said, "What more do we need? You're out of time." Then I emailed them the claim, and they were like, "Oh, geez, so you did issue a claim." They hemmed and hawed for a couple of weeks, then send my client a check for the $2 million. Bunch of wankers. I hate insurance companies. The next comment is from Steampunk Hoovian. I can feel the frustration of this story. I'm 2 months post-cancer treatment, fighting with my insurance because someone broke in and robbed us at our QC home. I got stuck in on after my mother had been admitted into the ICU at the beginning of COVID. Thankfully, she pulled through, then began the rehabilitation. Relearning to walk, wound care, and my father's knee replacements followed by my cancer diagnosis as. I was getting ready to move back to my house. Our insurance called us today after telling us they would cover and having us fill paperwork in July. They say they audited the claim and that it was not valid that they wouldn't cover. But hey, they will cover the window in good faith. BS. It's a mess. 2 months later after they okayed the claim. I don't know how much fight I have left in me. But hey, at least the last riding mower payment was made after it got stolen. Robbery discovered a week after. My husband would physically go to the property here and there, and my uncle and friends looked out for it. We even had cameras. These thieves crawled on the ground at night to unscrew the camera cables. Apologies for sounding so irate. I'm tired and worn from all the chemo and radiation combined with the last 3 years of events. COVID was but a scratch compared to it all. Another comment is from Iceed Picture 3312. I had a boss who wasn't the brightest bulb in the lamp. I kept every email he ever sent me because I had to show them to him many times. He would send an email with my name on the TO line and others on the CC line. In our company, if your name is on the TO line, you have action, and if it's on the CC line, it's just for information. After several days, he heard me discussing the project with another person. Once that discussion was finished, he asked me what I was doing talking to X about that project. I responded that he had tasked me with updating this project, and X was an integral part of my update. He insisted that he never told me to be involved with this project, that he had assigned this to A. I pulled up his email, showed it to him. I was on the TO line. A was on the CC line. He had verbally told A to work on this project, so we had 2 people working on the same thing. Never got an apology for error or the wasted time. This was only one time something like this happened. It was a perfect revenge. Frank's attempt to throw the lawyer under the bus backfired and engulfed his career, and the lawyer turned to be a hero for the company as he saved millions of the company even without instructions from the authorities.